Okay, welcome back to F-Tag Journal. This is F557. This is about respect, dignity, and personal property of the resident. Setup's the same, even though this is a very short F-Tag. It's going to be a little bit of an overview, citation history, go over the interpretive guidelines, which is not a whole lot, what the surveyors are going to look for, some actual citations, which on this one, and you'll see why in the overview what I talk about. There are a ton of citations in here that really don't have anything to do with this citation, but you'll see in the next slide here. Then we'll just do a summary. So an overview. This is about personal property and the justifications for limiting the resident's personal property while they're in the facility. As you can imagine, there's certainly space limitations. And if somebody's in their own room and they don't allow a recliner or something like that, there needs to be a justification for not having some of the residents' personal property. And even on top of that, the facility should be encouraging the resident to make it as home-like as possible, especially if they're a long-term care resident. And the one thing I alluded to is that F557 is pretty much a catch-all citation for any issue that indicates the resident is not being treated with dignity and respect. There's a ton of cross-tagging where, the facility will get a citation on something totally unrelated to this citation, and then they'll tack this citation on, and you'll kind of see that as we go through the actual citations. So what is the actual citation history? Well, when you look at 2018 and 2019, starting with 2018, it was the 74th ranked citation. So 73 other citations got cited more than this one. And there was only a total of 341 citations nationally. In 2019, it dropped a ranking to 75, and there was 4 more of these cited. Even though the ranking dropped, there was still 4 more cited. And as far as whether it's an annual survey or a complaint survey, looks like it's pretty much split down the middle, a little bit leaning towards the annual side, but that's about it. And as far as the scope and severity, with most of these citations, they're all going to be D's and E's, 95 to 99% of them are going to be D's and E's. With F557, there were 3 F's and 2 G's, but nothing higher than a G level in 2018. As far as the state distribution, nothing really jumps out except for California. Even though they have 1,200 plus facilities, they still have 95 citations for this F557, and it doesn't look like any other state, even Texas, who has 1,200 facilities as well, doesn't even come close. They've got just a little more than half of the citations is California. So let's see which states were the least cited and which ones were the most. Well, 13 states had no F557 citations, so good for them. Followed by Tennessee, Minnesota, Mississippi, and Nebraska, all with less than 0.5% of their facilities getting a citation. The most cited states, I did mention California, so I was right on that one. At 8%, New Mexico, DC, Alaska, and Maryland round out the most cited states for F557. So the interpretive guidelines. As I mentioned, there's not a whole lot to the interpretive guidelines. It's a very short F557 section. But it's basically, again, it falls into the resident rights. There's 35 F tags in the resident rights category, and this one is about promoting independence and a home-like environment for the residents. What this is about is retaining and using residents' personal property, and that includes furnishings as well as their clothing. They want to make sure that it is allowed to the extent possible with space permitting, unless the use of the resident's personal property or furnishing infringes upon other residents' rights, other residents' health, or other residents' safety. And this is pretty much half of what the interpretive guideline says is that element. The next element here is just what the surveyors are going to look for. And basically they're just going to try to determine if in the last slide those were actually followed. So what do we got? What they're going to ask is that are residents encouraged to have and use their personal possessions? And they're going to ask the resident, they're going to ask the family, they're going to ask the responsible party if the residents were encouraged to bring in their personal possessions, especially if they're going to be a long-term care resident. They're also going to ask if the residents are allowed to choose to keep personal possessions. And if they are not, what was the justification for the restriction? So I've been in facilities that have very tiny rooms. We did have to limit, like we had a couple of residents that wanted to bring in their massive recliners, and we just couldn't allow them to do it because there was absolutely no way that we could fit the 2 beds into the facility. We did our best to accommodate, and when we had a private room, we did do our best to accommodate when rooms were available. And the last piece that the surveyor is going to have to determine is, was the justification for the limitation or the restriction communicated to the resident and the responsible party. Okay, let's get into the actual citations. So the first one, as I mentioned before, this is kind of a catch-all for anything that indicates a resident was not treated with dignity or respect. So, resident had been on isolation. They were given disposable trays, came off isolation, and they were still being given disposable trays for meals. And so the surveyor thought that was a lack of respect, a lack of dignity. Nurse continued to interrupt resident council meetings. Resident's name was not on his door. A resident was spoon-fed his medications in a public area. The resident had no individual decorations or belongings, which I wish they would have gone a little more in depth with that, because I've been in a facility and had my own office for over 2 years, and I never brought in any decorations. I'm just not a decorating person at all. I leave that up to other people. So resident is in wheelchair with slings still under him. Resident items are still in boxes after 90 days, and the resident needed help to decorate the room, and he did not get it. Resident was called a late bloomer for frequently sleeping in. The facility had a house dog, and there was urine and dog poop that was not cleaned up. Same facility, resident had items that were chewed up by the house dog. Responsible party was not given ample notice about the facility who was going to remove or box up a resident's massive stuffed animal collection that they had brought to the facility. There was just not enough room for all the stuffed animals when the resident got a roommate. A resident's diamond ring that was stored in a lockbox went missing. Resident slept all night without linens on their bed. Again, a dignity, lack of respect. The resident DC'd home, and the facility had lost their wheelchair. So that one actually does relate to personal property. It was the resident's wheelchair. Outside vendor did not have an ID badge on. I'm not sure how they connect that to a lack of respect or a lack of dignity or any of the residents' personal property, but evidently, again, like I said, it's a catch-all. Resident's clothing was in the wrong closet. Resident left uncovered during a bed bath, and the resident even actually complained of being cold, and the staff did not put a blanket over him. Staff removed items from the room because it was a fire hazard, but the resident was not informed or asked. The staff just went ahead and did it. Resident had repeated falls, and staff had the resident sleeping on a floor mat. Evidently, we've had some fall preventions where we put the floor mats on the floor and all that stuff, and I never got a citation for it. Not quite sure, it didn't explicitly state in this particular citation if having the resident sleep on the floor was planned, or if the resident started out in the bed and then was on the floor. Failed to honor female-only caregiver request. Resident was left naked on the toilet. Resident was dragged across the floor back to the floor mat. So in this case, when I read through it, it was clear that what the staff were trying to do was, obviously it wasn't the best way to do it, but they were trying to get the resident back onto a padded floor mat. The resident had rolled off the floor mat and they were trying to get him back on. Surveyor decided it as they were just dragging him across the floor. And when I read it, it kind of sounded like the surveyor was trying to make it sound like they just grabbed him by the ankle and, just drug him back on the floor. And then as you read through it, you start to see that they were trying to assist the resident get back on the floor mat because the ground was hard and cold. Nevertheless, got a citation, and don't drag the residents across the floor. The staff removed scissors from an alert and oriented resident. The medical director or physician was asking health questions to a resident in the hallway. Slow laundry turnaround time. The resident's inventory sheet was not updated when they brought in new clothing. CNA and resident were arguing about showers in the hallway. Resident with missing clothing. Resident did not have their own clothing, and no one attempted to get the resident's clothing from his home. So a resident went to the ER and he didn't have any clothing. I don't know what the circumstances were around his visit to the ER and where his clothing went, or even if he had any, or what happened to him, but the facility never attempted to go to his home and get clothing for him. A resident's clothing was used for other residents who did not have clothing. Resident was unable to use their own razors and only could use the razors that were supplied by the facility. Resident wearing a torn gown. Move on to the next page. You can see there's a lot of citations. Resident forced to smoke in the rain because his wheelchair was too big for the gazebo entrance. That could have been an easy fix. You extend, or even if it's a temporary extension with a tarp or something like that and a couple of aluminum poles. Won't look nice, but as long as it's not a permanent fixture, you might be able to get away with it, and it's certainly better than letting the resident smoke in the rain. Resident lost eyeglasses during an ER visit. That one I couldn't figure out if the resident even actually took the eyeglasses to the ER, or while the resident was at the ER, his eyeglasses, which were left at the facility, were lost. It didn't delineate between the two. Resident not notified. Clothes being cleaned for bed bugs. Resident complained that staff were reckless with their personal belongings. Resident's brief was visible in their wheelchair pouch. Resident's belly was hanging out of their shirt in a common area. The staff threw out residents' food without asking first. A mini fridge was removed from resident's room. Resident was called by the incorrect pronoun. So if it was a she, they were called a he, or he, she, or nowadays it's a they, or I don't know. I heard one time that there's now 27 or more pronouns. AIDS upset. Resident poops. Resident was offended that the aides were complaining how often the resident is incontinent or has to use the bathroom. Aide turned off the resident's TV without permission. Staff did not use the resident's preferred name. I think the resident had a nickname. And staff were probably, if it was a new admission, probably unaware that the resident preferred to be called by a nickname or something like that. Nurse mentioned resident was overweight during cares. Resident was made to wear an orange jumpsuit. Heat pad was taken from a resident without permission. Staff took away a resident's call light and they gave them a bell. Resident overheard staff complain of resident eating too slowly. Resident spilled 2 glasses of juice on himself and there was no assistance given to clean him up or assist him with drinking glasses of juice. Aide took a phone away from a resident while talking on it. Resident recliner was upside down, and was covered in dirt. Resident was not allowed a mini fridge in their room. Missing window blinds. Staff mocked resident who smelled poorly. Staff put hand over the mouth of a screaming resident, and I'm surprised that's not a harm tag. Staff ignored a resident who was yelling because they were talking on their phones. Resident only had donated clothing. Resident complained no assistance with putting their personal items in their dresser. Resident's ceramic elephant collection was boxed up so a roommate could have a bigger TV. Resident requested for a particular employee not to talk to her, and that request was not honored. Staff lost key to a resident's closet, and the resident did not have access to their closet for 10 days. Staff used a spoon to scoop spilled food off their clothing. Resident complained that incontinence supplies were stored visibly in her room. And we move on to the last page of citations here. We'll wrap it up with a G level at the end. No assist resident to unpack their suitcase for up to 2 weeks. There was 2 people in the room, and one of the residents passed away, and the deceased body was left on the floor for 2 hours until the funeral home arrived. Readmit items not brought to new room in a timely manner, so the resident went to the hospital for a few days. They did a room change because they had to put a resident in that particular room. And when the resident came back to a different room, his or her items were not brought to the new room for a couple days. Resident was not allowed to display her artwork on her door. Staff confiscated the resident's cell phone. Staff showed the resident's bra to her to prove to her that the resident was a woman. Inventory list was not signed. Staff used diapers, the word diapers, in front of family. So the staff said, I need to change your diapers, and that was in front of the family. Lack of dignity, lack of respect. Soiled brief in the garbage can in resident's room. Resident's mail was opened by staff. There were no locks on the bathroom doors. Missing items after discharge from facility. So in this case, the inventory sheet that they brought in when they discharged, not all the items that were brought in were able to be taken home with the resident when they discharged home because a few items had been lost. Resident complained of missing cigarettes, and that's any facility that has smoking, you're going to get that unless you have a meticulous, basically a cigarette tracking, and all the staff are on board diligently signing out cigarettes with a correct count. I mean, every facility I've been at, that's been a problem. Soiled wipes in residents' garbage can in their room. Name on clothing was visible. Staff said to a resident, I can't be in your room all the damn time. Resident not allowed to use their power chair. However, there are no assessments in order to justify taking away the resident's power chair. And there was no mention of any incident that would have, I guess, attempted to justify temporarily taking away their power chair until an assessment could be completed. No attempt to honor the resident's food preferences. Damaged clothing from laundry service. Improper fitting briefs on a resident. No clean clothes, and the resident's closet was full of dirty clothing, so the facility was not cleaning the resident's clothes, just putting them back in the closet. Wrong names on the doors, and that can be dangerous, especially if you have some staffing agency personnel that are working there. Resident with fly swatter was in the dining room during a meal. Obviously, they got a fly problem. Housekeeping berated a resident for having a filthy room. Okay, so the G-level citation, G scope and severity, I know there were two that were cited at the G level, but there was only one that I could actually find, the 2567 with information. The other one just said information not available when I looked at the facility that had received that G-level citation. So anyway, this one's pretty extreme. The licensed nurse told a resident, go ahead and die. You can definitely see why that would be considered a harm tag. I know things can get pretty stressful for nurses on the floor, especially when they're just running around all day and sweating, especially if you got a facility that doesn't have great air conditioning and you're going 100 miles an hour and dripping with sweat. I've seen it many times, but there's just really no excuse for a nurse, and we just can't have it happen, to just kind of lose control of their emotions. It does happen, but you're going to get cited for it, or worse. I know myself that I had a fantastic nurse who told a resident to shut up. She had never done anything like that before, and she'd worked for me for a couple years, was incredibly reliable, and the company I was working for at the time said I just had to fire her. And I said absolutely not. I talked to the surveyor. I said, hey, look, this is the nurse's reputation. You can ask around, stuff like that. And the surveyor, surprisingly, went and talked to the resident, and the resident was like, yeah, I'm not really bothered by it. It happens. I was being a jerk. And so we were able to keep the employee, and she was quite glad about that, and I was quite glad to keep her. So, all right, so the summary, rough estimate, about 50% of F557 citations really have something to do with personal possessions. And as I mentioned in the overview, it's kind of a split between that, and the other 50% are, generally speaking, just kind of a catch-all, as anything the surveyors decided that really fell into the realm of residents being treated with a lack of dignity or respect. So kind of a 50-50 split. And I don't mean, when I say 50-50 split, I don't mean like if you go all through all the citations that I listed on here. I just mean from all the ones that I researched, and when I looked through them, it's kind of about 50-50 for the most part. And again, rough estimate. I didn't do an exact count or categorize them or anything like that. But it gives you an idea that you need to deal with the personal possessions and the dignity and respect issues in equal measure, so to speak. So that is it for F557.